I will share my thoughts with you today on why I think fiscal policy will make or break Trinidad and Tobago. You would see that there is a paper that the Chamber so kindly printed and distributed, which I had written some time ago when I was still at RBC, so forgive the lack of updating there of my bio, but it's basically the basis for what I will share with you today. And why I think we so desperately need this kind of fiscal reform and a fiscal responsibility framework. And today I will start with my conclusion that I am convinced that the level and nature of government spending determines most of the socio-economic outcomes we experience today and will continue to experience. And until there is the requisite leadership and political will demonstrated by the government, any government, to put limits on itself, we will continue on this downward spiral that we have been on for the past, well, it's debatable how long it has been. For me, it's probably about 10 years, but some people would stretch it even beyond that. And if we don't do it, as we're here to talk about outlooks as well, if we don't do it, like Mitch said, like Ravi said, the IMF will be here in 2021, 2022 by my estimation, and they will do it for us, just like they did in Jamaica and in Grenada. And of course, their outcomes have been blissful, but if you look at Suriname, they have not had the same outcome. And I would guess that our structure is closer to that of Suriname than it is to Jamaica or Grenada. So to convince you now of why I feel this way, I will tell you a story. So I was doing my speaking notes to deliver at the launch of the UN's Human Development Index a couple of years ago, and my son jumped into bed and was marking what I was writing and looked at me and said, "Mommy, what is poverty?" So I said, well, I know he knows what it is to be poor. I said, well, poverty is the noun for the adjective. And he says, well, what causes poverty? I said, well, what if you could figure that one out, you'll get a Nobel Prize, right? Why don't you tell me what you think causes poverty? And he said, after he thought for a little while, he said, I know what causes poverty, Mommy. The government. Of course, I had a good laugh, just like you, but before I dismissed what he said, I thought, let me think about that for a second. And then he got up and he drew this. There we go. I know the writing is kind of illegible there, but he drew this pie chart as to what he thought was the representation of how many of us are poor versus average versus rich. So I said to him, wow, three quarters of us are poor? Why? He says, well, they don't have proper housing, they don't have anywhere to live, they don't have a car to get around in, and they don't have the things that make them happy, like iPads. And he said, you see these people here, Mommy, with the smile, that's us. Because we have a house, we have a car, and of course we have iPads. So I said, but what about these guys here then, these rich guys? He said, well, they have everything we have, and they have a private jet. So that's why they have to smile with big teeth, right? When you think about it in that sense, this is actually what he was speaking about is what is known as multi-dimensional poverty. He's probably right in terms of the breakdown. So anyway, we got to thinking about all of this, and I started to look into what might be, if there might be any merit to what he said. So if you think about what the government spends money on and why the government spends money, we believe How many of us in this room are taught and we believe that when the government spends more, they generate jobs, they generate growth, they generate better living standards, less poverty, etc., etc. Is that not why the government exists? No? Yes? Yeah, Raquel, this audience. I don't know what they put in the coffee this morning. But anyway, that's what I was taught as an economist, in university, that government spending is supposed to improve lives and supposed to improve living standards, right? Fiscal spending between the years 2009 and 2014 grew by about 30% to peak at 63 billion roughly in fiscal 2014. But at the same time, this is a chart showing you the poverty rates throughout the Caribbean. And you will see that we are somewhere in the middle. And at the same time that fiscal spending grew by 30%, the amount of people living below the poverty line in Trinidad and Tobago went from 16.7% of the population to 24%, increased by 50%. How is that possible? Maybe more of us became unemployed. Nope. As a matter of fact, the number of employed persons expanded by 47,000. Transfers to households in the same period of time almost doubled to about 14.3 billion from about 7.2 billion over the same time period. That's scientific proof, if I needed any, that the government probably did cause the poverty rate to rise in Trinidad and Tobago. So we know that government spending did not, at least then, result in better living standards and poverty outcomes. But does government spending even generate growth? You all might recall that the way that we measure GDP, I wish I had a whiteboard here to do this, but the way that we measure GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports, right? So if we increase consumption, we increase investment, we increase government spending, and we increase exports, we're supposed to get larger GDP, right? We're supposed to get growth. So in other words, if we want growth, the government should spend more, right? But what we see instead is over that period where we had a 30% increase in fiscal spending, and throughout the entire post-2008 period, we have had growth that averaged close to zero, if not negative, depending on what statistic you use for last year's contraction. Why did this happen? Well, the first thing is that what they don't teach us in school is that we have this frustrating thing called leakage. Before you get any ideas, leakage undermines the effectiveness of growth and government spending, of consumption and government spending in generating growth. Why? Because according to the United Nations Environment Program, 80 to 90% of what we consume in the Caribbean is imported and is therefore considered leakage. And I want to make the point that because of this phenomenon called leakage, higher government spending, 98% of which in any event on average is recurrent, actually does not generate growth. It just promotes consumption, and consumption promotes imports. This is a chart from the IMF that shows a breakdown of a few countries in the Caribbean and what their fiscal multiplier looks like. The fiscal multiplier means the multiplier effect of fiscal spending. And as you can see, our fiscal multiplier is quite low. Not the lowest in this region, but quite low. And according to the IMF, the impact multiplier of government spending in Trinidad and Tobago is 32%, meaning of every dollar that the government spends, in the long term, only 32 cents are added to GDP. But is there another reason why fiscal spending does not generate growth in Trinidad and Tobago? And as a matter of fact, there is. We are on the dark side of debt. Empirical studies show that once your debt to GDP level crosses 56%, every additional dollar of debt has a negative effect on GDP. So every additional dollar that our government borrows actually causes GDP to contract. And as you can see where we are on that chart there. And there are other factors that also would translate into government spending having a negative effect on growth. And that's crowding out. When the government spends more, there is less liquidity available for all of you to borrow from the banking sector. It drives the cost of borrowing up, it drives sovereign credit ratings down, and it drives the cost of sovereign borrowing as well up further. And therefore, before we know it, we're heading on a slippery slope. Now, if you go back to the equation, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports equals GDP, we assume that investment is one of those that drives growth, right? And it does, but government investment, does government investment drive growth? According to a study done in 2012, 72.5% of public investment is unproductive. Almost 3/4 of government investment is unproductive. Why do we think that is the case? And as Nirad mentioned, corruption. We have not seen a meaningful decline in corruption in recent years, certainly according to the World Bank statistics and Transparency International statistics. And if you look at the competitiveness index, the number one most problematic factor for doing business is poor work ethic. But then the 4 factors after that speak to corruption and white-collar crime. That just goes to show how important and how difficult this makes our challenge, our journey to achieving growth and achieving better living standards really is. And as Raquel said, you know, some of us could get down on our knees and pray for the oil price to go up, and it will save us, right? Well, the problem with that is that because leakage is high and fiscal multipliers are low, the benefits of oil and gas revenue, really much of which accrue to the fiscal purse, really will not make a big difference to us. And there was a study that ranked all of these countries. The ones in yellow are the ones who are considered to have escaped Dutch disease, and the ones in blue are the ones, like ourselves, have not. And it is those countries that have stronger institutions that actually benefit from their resource endowment, whereas because we have weak institutions, we do not benefit from our resource endowment. And empirical studies have shown that higher oil prices will not save us. Why doesn't the government just spend less? Well, perhaps if they knew better, if they've seen examples of how lower fiscal spending can actually generate growth still, they might be convinced otherwise. And as mentioned by earlier speakers, we have the example of Jamaica, which, by the way, has the most austere budget of any sovereign on the planet. They aimed for a primary fiscal surplus of 7% of GDP last year and came in at 7.7. And then you have the Cayman Islands as well, that has generated growth for 16 consecutive quarters alongside a fiscal surplus, overall fiscal surplus averaging anywhere between 2 to 3% of GDP. If they can do it, why can't we? And by the way, Grenada is the same. They also generate growth alongside fiscal responsibility framework, again, via the IMF program that they were under. So we obviously do not have this pattern of spending. We have pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which means when we have more, we spend more. When we have less, we have no choice but to spend less. But doesn't it make sense that when you have more, you should put aside some of it, put aside more of it, so that when you have less, you have more to spend? And I'll share with you a bit of an excerpt from a study that was done in 2013, which was found that fiscal policy stance in Trinidad and Tobago is predominantly pro-cyclical, potentially magnifying the effects of the business cycle. So if the business cycle is going like this, pro-cyclical fiscal policy makes it go like this, right? And if this study further found that we are pro-cyclical on two levels. It is accommodative in times of growth and austere during slowdowns, but also fiscal policy was found to be even more accommodative in the 12 to 18 months prior to a general election. So we're not just going like this, we're going like this, right? Very wide oscillations that, of course, is very unhealthy, very volatile, and is not conducive to stability and confidence. But it's human nature to want to spend more when we have more. But it's dangerous. These bullet points here are as a result of many studies done that I summarized here. The effects. Pro-cyclical fiscal policy amplifies the effect of the oil price volatility on the overall economy. It reduces long-term growth. It is negatively related to income levels. And it crowds out private spending and investment and usually results in a decline in private sector output and employment. In other words, pro-cyclical fiscal policy destroys diversification efforts and private sector non-energy activity. We need to put an end to pro-cyclical fiscal policy. So what to do? Well, we can have legislated fiscal responsibility frameworks that mandate counter-cyclical fiscal policy. There was a study done, and I think every Trinidadian should read this study. It was done by Kira Primus, who used to work at our central bank and who is now at the IMF. And she did a study that found that we have pretty much spent our entire energy windfall. We saved $2.6 billion in the HSF. The rest of it was earned by the fund manager, $2.6 billion, and we have been producing oil and gas for over 100 years. We have spent almost all of it, and when she did her work, she found that spending all of the energy revenue creates more volatility, which is what we've been experiencing, and as I spoke about earlier. And she found that the optimal level of savings of energy revenues is about 80%. If we put aside 80% of our energy fiscal revenue, we will effectively eliminate this volatility, this pro-cyclicality, and this harm that we are doing to the overall macroeconomy. And I believe that the government should not be allowed to access the Heritage and Stabilization Fund unless their tax administration is at an acceptable level. I have heard various estimates. Somewhere between 40 and 50% is what I hear that we collect relative to what we should be collecting. Yet we are allowed to dip into the HSF. Where is the incentive to beef up the tax administration if we have this avenue? And finally, I believe we need to deal with corruption. We need to hold somebody, anybody, accountable. The last time I heard anybody was put away for corruption in this country, I was in high school. It was some judge that was like, I don't want to put a date on myself, like 30 years ago? I don't know. You all remember that? Did anybody else ever in 30 years look at where we are in the Corruption Perceptions Index? In 30 years, almost nobody. Anybody knows of anybody? I would love to know. And since we're here to talk about outlooks, I just want to make two final points. The deficit on the fiscal accounts, our fiscal deficit, which is about 11 billion TT dollars this year if you do not count the capital transactions and one-off financing items, $11 billion this fiscal year. That deficit is the major driver of the deficit on the current account of the balance of payments, meaning that that fiscal deficit is the key driver of the net outflow of US dollars taking place in the economy. If you fix that, you will begin to fix the foreign exchange problem that we have, which is a whole other matter which I can't get into today. And finally, we need to, so that's one thing I want to say about the outlook. Unless we fix this fiscal problem, we will not fix our foreign exchange problem. And the other thing is, like I started out by saying, if we do not do this now for ourselves, based on the cash burn of about 110 million US dollars on average that is flowing out in terms of foreign exchange outflows, net outflows, if we continue like this, my estimate is that by 2021, 2022, we will have a balance of payments crisis, and we will have to ask the IMF to come here and fix it for us, because we have some huge sovereign maturities in 2020 and Petrotrin in 2019 and I think 2021. If we don't fix this problem now, as Ravi, Raquel, and Nirad said, this is a pivotal year. We don't fix this now, well, we have to prepare ourselves for the IMF in 2021, 2022 by my estimates. That is how I will end in terms of my outlook. I thank you for your time and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.